All right, man, peace. So, brothers, this is going to be the post-fight coverage pertaining to Mr. Jermell Charlo's attempt at becoming the unanimous super welterweight champion. He was trying to take the belt from Mr. Brian Castaño. And to tell you the truth, and I know that I'm late in covering this fight, this was a great bout because once again we saw the great matchup between the quote-unquote boxer or boxer-puncher, that being Mr. Jermell Charlo, against the alleged brawler or slugger in Mr. Brian Castaño. And this is a matchup that is as old as time in boxing. I will be the first one to admit that I had not even heard of Brian Castaño until about 2 weeks before this fight was to take place. I did hear that he was able to defeat Erislandy Lara. I didn't take too much stock in that because I do know that Lara is getting up there in age, but whenever you're able to defeat a Cuban champion, you have to be extremely well schooled, disciplined, and talented. Now, of course, it was revealed right before the fight when I believe Brian Custer interviewed Errol Spence. Now, it was revealed prior to the bout between Charlo and Castaño that Castaño had engaged in some amateur bouts, or at least one amateur bout with Errol Spence, which is very common. A lot of the more well-schooled fighters, the ones who gain great renown or prominence in the professionals, they have a lot of global experience, whether it be in the Pan Am Games or the Olympics, or, you know, just touring the world in an attempt to learn the various styles. And that's why Errol Spence is so good now, because a lot of the amateur fighters, especially those who are able to maintain a high standing in the amateur program for a long period of time, when they do become professionals, they've seen everything and they've done everything. They've experienced every scenario. Well, Brian Custer was interviewing Errol Spence, and he asked about Brian Castaño. And Castaño was one of the fighters who was able to defeat Errol Spence as an amateur. So that was another hint, in addition to that, you know, that symbiotic relationship between the boxer and the slugger, that this was going to be a very good fight. Because, again, if you're able to defeat Lara, and the Charlos have proactively ran from Lara for many years, even though he was their stablemate, they knew that he knows how to fight them because they were pretty much under his tutelage for many years. And just the fact that Castaño was able to defeat Lara, a fighter who, you know, he gives everybody hell for the most part, Lara does. And still to this day, the worst robbery that I think I've ever seen was probably the fight between Lara and Paul Williams. I mean, that was an absolutely horrendous decision. But just to get back to the point, I'd never heard of Castaño. Once I heard that he was Argentinian, though, I knew that it was going to be a great fight, because if anyone knows about the great Argentinian fighters, once they're able to get to the national stage, you know, that's what we consider American bouts, the national stage and pretty much the global stage. If you can make it to a fight here in America, you have to be great. And the Argentine fighters are known for being extremely tough, dogged, very hard punchers, and difficult to put away. And that's going all the way back to Louis Firpo. For those of you who don't know who Louis Firpo was, he was a guy who knocked Jack Dempsey out of the ring back in the early 1920s. You had a guy like Oscar Bonavena who gave Joe Frazier hell, knocked Joe Frazier down multiple times. He fought Joe Frazier twice in the late 60s and went 15 rounds with Ali and staggered Ali. And I believe it was Ali's second fight back from his exile in 1971. Just a few years ago, you had Lucas Matisse, the Machine, who was just demolishing everybody that he faced. That's until Danny Garcia was able to kind of lay out the blueprint on how to defeat Matisse in what was, to this day, the greatest performance of Danny Garcia's entire career. Going into that fight, I believe that Garcia was the slight underdog. I'll never forget, that was the undercard to Mayweather-Canelo. That bout was way back in 2013. And that was when Garcia reached his peak as a fighter. Like, there were some rumblings about Garcia possibly moving up in weight to welterweight to fight Mayweather next. I think that Mayweather actually was trying to build up Garcia to fight him next. But unfortunately, Garcia had that very poor performance in Puerto Rico against that other 140-pound fighter. And after that, people never really looked at him the same after that bout in Puerto Rico that he had, where he was trying to build up his following more. He just did not perform well. And he showed in that fight that when he's in the ring against a great boxer, he can be nullified. Garcia looked so great against Matisse because Matisse did not have fast feet. And that tends to be the problem with many Argentine fighters. They have a lot of great qualities, but their feet tend to not be very good. For whatever reason, though, they tend to have amazing power. Some people claim that it's the steroid in the Argentinian beef. Who knows? Either way, that country is very intense about their sports. I just read an article a while back about Matt Damon talking about how his wife is Argentinian. And, you know, they went back to Argentina to visit her family. And he attended a soccer match with his father-in-law. But his father-in-law told him, yeah, I'll take you to the soccer match, but no women, no children. And Matt Damon said, why? What's going on? And when he got to the arena, or when he got to the stadium, I should say, he understood why. Because they had barbed wire around it. Like, soccer, as a sporting event, is taken totally differently overseas than it is here in America, especially in South America. It's like a religion, especially in Argentina. Point being is that, you know, when they participate in sports, it really is like a way of life to them. And there are very few fighters that come out of Argentina that are not great, especially if they make it to America. You also had this cat, the great middleweight champion, the bisexual, allegedly, Sergio Martinez, you know, the guy who came to fame by beating Paul Williams in a rematch, knocking him out, and then having that great streak of victories at middleweight. I remember he beat up Kelly Pavlik, and eventually he was able to defeat Julio Cesar Chavez's son in that one super fight. He spent most of his career trying to chase around Floyd Mayweather. That is the one fight that I wish Floyd would have fought that he didn't fight in his career, especially since Floyd stated that he wanted to end his career by being the middleweight champion. I think that Floyd looked at Sergio Martinez and said, you know what, that guy's a little bit too big and also has a lot of skills and a lot of speed. He's too big for me to take that chance with him, that level of skill. But Sergio Martinez was an extraordinary fighter also. Now, do I think that he was on quote-unquote PEDs? Wouldn't surprise me at all. He had a cyclist background, and that sport is known for using EPOs or blood-thinning agents. Either way, just to get back to the point, once I found out that Castaño was an Argentine boxer, I knew that it was going to be a great fight. And the thing about Charlo, both Charlos have a lot of flaws to their fight game, but particularly with Jermell, his output is very low and he does not go to the body at all. He's become a head-hunting super welterweight who is enamored with his power. He does not even have that many knockouts. And unfortunately for Jermell, anytime there's a close fight, most of the viewers of a close fight involving him are going to think that he lost. Why is that? Because he appears to be very unlikable. He has zero charisma at all. Like, there's an art to playing the bad guy. Floyd Mayweather was able to make himself a likable bad guy, quote unquote. For a while, Muhammad Ali was a likable bad guy. At least back in the 60s, he was considered a quote unquote bad guy. But he was very likable because of his charisma. Unfortunately for the Charlos, they have zero charisma. So people are not only going to want to see them lose, it's not even like they're going to get great ratings per se or great viewership in the process of people wanting to see them lose. But if you're Derek James, Jermell Charlo's trainer, in the rematch for Castaño, Jermell Charlo's going to have to go to the body more. I don't remember over the course of the fight Derek James telling Jermell Charlo to go to the body more, which is how he would have slowed down Castaño a little bit more. Especially when you have a smaller fighter like that who just keeps coming forward and wants to keep a sustained attack. You have to break him down by going to the body. Floyd Mayweather had a tremendous fight. His last fight at super featherweight, the 130-pound division, he fought a small, or at least a shorter fighter in stature by the name of Jesus Chavez. And it was one of Floyd's best performances. Of course, Floyd had a bunch of great performances at 130 and 135 and 140. But this happened to be his last fight at 130. And what was so amazing about it was, of course, not only the great boxing prowess and skill that he displayed, but also the fact that Floyd had not eaten anything for 4 days prior to the fight because he was having so much trouble making weight. But he was still able to fight that night. Like, he was not tired at all, and like he just had an amazing amount of stamina. But the point being is that Floyd levied a sustained body attack to Chavez. Mayweather, before he had hand problems, his offense was non-pareil. So, you know, that's why sometimes it's ironic that he's become known as this great defensive fighter. Early in his career, he was known as a great boxer-puncher. But just getting back to the focus of this video, Jermell Charlo, he has to start bring a more sustained body attack to slow Castaño down, and it has to be early. Now, many fighters don't like to go to the body because they believe that it puts them in harm's way to get countered. But there's a way to go to the body and protect yourself if your footwork is as fast and as crisp as it needs to be, and if your head movement is as good as it needs to be. These are both problems for Charlo, who has very slow feet, for a guy who is alleged to be a boxer puncher, and who has almost no head movement at all. As a matter of fact, beyond not having any head movement, Charlo seems to have this defect where his head is cocked to the left. And what that does is it exposes the right side of his jaw, and it leaves him open for a counter left hook. And we saw over the course of the 12-round fight that Castaño was constantly catching Charlo with counter left hooks or blind left hooks. When I say a blind left hook, meaning Castaño was not even looking at the target when he threw the punch, but he knew where Charlo's head and where his jaw was going to be. And Charlo was constantly getting caught with that shot. He got wobbled a couple of times early in the fight. Honestly, I thought that Castaño dominated the fight. I thought that Charlo had two great moments, round 10. And also, I believe when he hurt Castaño, I believe it was in round 3. Other than that, I thought that Castaño won almost every other round. I didn't even think the fight was very close. In round 12, basically rounds 10 through 12, Charlo was better. But throughout the fight, Castaño basically dominated him the whole fight, and Castaño should have gotten the decision for that fight, but we know that Charlo is the in-house fighter. If he's unable to make any adjustments or adaptations for the next fight, I do believe that they're going to pull the plug on Charlo. What's going on right now, though, is that I believe that the Derrick James stable, in accord with the PBC, they're trying to coordinate the mutual movement upwards in weight of both Charlo and Errol Spence. They don't want to bring Errol Spence into the 154-pound division with Charlo still there. At least I believe that that's what this is about. They want them both to move up at the same time because, of course, when Errol Spence does move up to 154, he's going to want to become champion. And if Charlo is there and they're both fighting under the same stable, that's going to cause a great amount of a fracture in their relationship, and Derrick James is going to have an issue on his hands. So they want Charlo to get all the belts if he can, or lose all the belts if he can, and most likely move up after his next fight, maybe next 2 fights, because Errol Spence don't have but 2, maybe 3 fights left at 147. But just to get back to the topic, I thought that Charlo was dominated the whole fight. I thought that he was confused. He was flummoxed by many of Castaño's tactics and his attacks. He had no idea really how to defend against Castaño because he was unwilling to do what it takes to break down an opponent who's utilizing those tactics. You have to go to the body. You have to utilize a sustained body attack on a puncher who is, using those tornado techniques trying to wear you down. Charlo just kept headhunting, and I think that it built up confidence in Castaño. And in fighters like that, you don't want their confidence to build up, especially those Argentines, man. Great fighters. I mean, we've seen it again. Like I mentioned before, Bonavena, he gave Ali hell. We just saw a few years ago where Marcos Maidana gave Floyd Mayweather hell in both of their fights. Now, in the second fight, it was more of a boxer-type fight where Floyd decided to take a safer tact. But even in that fight, I've never seen Floyd more hurt from one punch than that counter right that Marcos Maidana landed on Floyd. I believe that it was at the end of round 2 where he had Floyd stumbling back to his corner. Never seen Floyd hurt like that. So those Argentine fighters, they're known for being very tough, very rough, and hard punchers. And the way that you break those guys down is by going to the body. That's what Floyd did in both of his fights against Maidana, and that's the reason why he was able to pull off the victory both times. As a matter of fact, he was hurting Maidana so much to the body in the second fight that Maidana bit his glove. Remember that? Where Floyd looked at the ref and like, he bit through my glove and all the other shit. But that's what Charlo's going to have to do in a rematch, because I thought that he lost this fight, and Castaño should be the unanimous super welterweight champion. So we'll see what happens in the next fight. So what's next for Mr. Jermell Charlo? Should he be successful in the rematch, which I'm not necessarily saying he will be, because I don't know if he's going to be able to make the adjustments that are necessary for a guy like this. And Jermell Charlo, again, is very talented. But talent can only get you so far. Once you get to the elite level of professional boxing, you have to be able to display adjustments or you're going to lose fights. But should he be able to defeat Castaño in the rematch, I think that they want to have him stay at 154 for a hot second to give Errol Spence time to clean out the rest of the welterweight division, assuming he'll be able to do that, so that they can coordinate their mutual movements upwards in weight. So should Jermell be successful and defeat Castaño in the rematch, or quote-unquote get the decision, they may have him fight Erickson Lubin again, who I think that they've been trying to build back up ever since Jermell knocked him out the first time. They may try to make the fight with Jarrett Hurd, who I think is a very, very limited super welterweight. I've always called him Frankenstein. He has terrible footwork. I have no idea what his coaches are teaching him. His shoulders are always square. His defense is not very good. He basically is a size bully in the 154-pound division. You know, he's a guy who's accustomed to being bigger and taller than most of his opponents, and he's taking advantage of that. Almost every time that he gets into the ring with someone who is around his size, he gets his ass whooped. I think that he just lost to the Cuban cat who used to be associated with Mayweather just a couple of weeks ago. But I do know that, you know, they were trying to build up Jarrett Hurd versus Jermell for a while. So who knows? His name might be in there. Erickson Lubin's name might be in there. And maybe a couple of other guys. But there's just not that much left. They might try to build up Tony Harrison again. There's just not that much left in the 154-pound weight class for Jermell Charlo, should he be able to become a unanimous 154-pound champion. But there is one guy who might enter his name into the 154-pound sweepstakes should Jermell enter himself into that unanimous champion, you know, echelon. Let's find out who that person is. Mr. Bud Crawford. Now, Mr. Bud Crawford, I think, considers himself a chess player. And he might be trying to play chess with Errol Spence. He may be saying, well, you know what? I can't get the fight with this guy, Errol Spence. People are now starting to scrutinize my resume, and they're noticing that I don't have that many big names. Since Errol Spence does not want to come to my side of the street, what I might do is move to 154 pounds and try to take the belt from his buddy, the guy who operates, you know, in his same stable, his stablemate, Mr. Jermell Charlo. Because I think that Bud Crawford watched that fight and saw a lot of weaknesses in Jermell. As great competitors always do, they watch their competition for weaknesses. They don't watch like fans do. Now, this is what Bud Crawford said after the fight. He said, Charlo lost, and I'm done talking about it. Now, why is he being so verbose about Charlo's fight? It's because he sees him as potential food. This is what else Bud Crawford said. He said, draw, y'all funny. Yeah, it was funny. That was a funny-ass decision. There's no way in the world that fight was a draw. I thought that Castaño won at least 8 rounds, maybe 9 rounds. At least 8, maybe 9. Now, some people might say, well, you say that Castaño won 8 rounds. A couple of rounds could have went either way on the judges' scorecards, and then you had that one round where one could make the case that even though Castaño was never knocked down, it could have been a 10-8 round. Look, I thought Castaño won 8-9 rounds. That's that. He won the fight. But I do believe that Bud Crawford is thinking about moving up to 154, especially if he can't get the Errol Spence fight soon or soon enough to his liking. And he's looking at Jermell Charlo as potential food for himself. Now, in my view, Bud Crawford should be trying to make the Sean Porter fight. That's a perfect fight for both fighters. Sean Porter will give Bud Crawford the big name that he's been searching for at welterweight. He will also provide Bud with definitely the best competition that he's ever faced in the welterweight division. People love to shit on Sean Porter when it's convenient for their narrative, and then come back and claim that Sean Porter is this great fighter who beat Errol Spence, also for their narrative. We have to give Sean Porter credit for what he is. He's a great... We have to give Sean Porter credit for what he is. He's a great truth machine fighter. He's going to reveal what exactly dwells within that chest of yours. How big is your heart? In every generation, you have a couple of truth machine fighters who are going to bring it out of you. What exactly is it that you bring to the table? Marcos Maidana was a truth machine fighter. Back in the day, Joe Frazier. In the 80s, Marvin Hagler. These are guys who are going to, when they're in the ring with their opponent is going to show either the best of themselves or the worst of themselves. So we'll see what happens with Bud Crawford. But it is a very interesting layout right now for boxing in the welterweight and the super welterweight division. Errol Spence was at ringside, and of course, Errol Spence is a competitor as well. I'm sure that he watched the fight between Jermell and Castaño, and he was looking at weaknesses that Jermell had because he's thinking about moving to 154. What if Errol and Jermell have an argument tomorrow and they fall out? And you know how Jermell is, he's very headstrong. Oh, I could beat that nigga. I could beat Errol Spence. Next thing you know, they could be fighting. So even though a guy's in your stable, you still have to look at him as potential food. Bud Crawford is looking that way. I think that Errol Spence is looking that way. Hopefully, we'll be able to get the Errol versus Bud fight, but that's for another video. But anyway, brothers asked me what I thought about this fight. I thought that Castaño won the fight. He should have gotten the decision. He got robbed, no doubt about it. To me, a fight that could have gone either way is a 7-5 fight, a 6-6 fight, maybe even an 8-4 fight. I think that 8-4 is the floor for this fight. I thought that you could make the case that Castaño won 9, maybe even 10 rounds in that bout. No doubt about it in my mind. And he definitely dominated, the overall architecture of the fight, how the fight was laid out, how it was built. He was able to determine where the fight was fought. Whenever he was able to get Charlo to back up against the ropes, he was able to land crisp shots. It wasn't like Charlo was picking off his shots. I just thought he got robbed, and Charlo did not commit to the body like how he was supposed to. He did not up his punch count how he needed to. Fortunately for him, he's the in-house fighter, so he got a very bad decision. So peace.